Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, the podcast asking what's wrong in business and how can we fix it. I'm Charlie Martin, your host, founder of TrueMark and the Andrew Greenwash Charter. And our article this week is Understanding the Environmental Attitude Behaviour Gap, the moderating role of dispositional mindfulness. And I'm delighted to say that our guest today to unpack all of this is Jeff Twentyman, Honorary Professor in Practice at UCL and one of the UK's most experienced advisors on governance, sustainability and leadership. Jeff, it's absolutely brilliant to have you on the show this morning. Thank you for giving up some of your time.
It's a great pleasure and really looking forward to our conversation.
Now, Jeff, I know we've been, you and I agreed to do this some time ago. So, I'm fascinated to hear myself as to all the various things that you're working on as we speak since we met. But can you just give our listeners and viewers who aren't aware of you and your work a bit more of a flavour as to what you're working on?
Yes, of course. And I'm afraid that's quite a big question in my sense, because I've sort of post the traditional stage of my career. I was a practicing lawyer for a long time, but for the last 2.5 years, I've been beyond professional life. And that's not to say I'm unprofessional, but I remain professional. I'm not a practicing professional lawyer. So I do a number of things. I sort of slightly react with hostility to being described as retired, because I in fact seem to do more work now than I did before. But I sit on the board of the Green Finance Institute. I'm currently the chairman of something called Blueprint for a Better Business. I have a coaching practice, including a sort of pro bono element, operating at Imperial College, actually, the greenhouse incubator there. Mm-hmm. I help climate technology startups with sort of moments of transition and challenge. I have some other coaching clients. I'm also, as you mentioned, honorary professor in practice at the Faculty of Law and Ethics at UCL, where I do some lecturing, and keep myself busy in the sort of sphere of professional ethics. And so, for example, quite recently, participated in the task force that produced a report on the legal profession and ethics and kleptocracy and grand corruption. So, on top of which, I also have a large garden and 5 children and a dog. So I'm quite fat. So.
Jeff, you've got a lot on your plate. Is quite the understatement. That's incredible. Does it ever make you wonder, like, how you ever found time to actually to do the professional part of your career?
I think it's one of the great cliches of people at my stage of their working life. They sort of wonder how I ever managed to do a desk-tied, office-based job that was demanding attention all the time. And I suppose the answer is quite a lot of things I do now just never got done before. So look, it's a wonderful place to be. I feel very lucky to have, if you like, got beyond the daily rhythm of turning up to the office and doing things that, the common unifying theme is that I actually want to do them. And that's not something that everyone can say about every element of work.
And Jeff, on that, just a question on that. Did you always know during your legal career the things that you were likely to want to do at this phase in your career, or have those things presented themselves as you've had the time and the space to think about where you want to focus your attention?
Well, it would be lovely to think that everything I do has been carefully thought through and planned, but that would not be true. I mean, the answer is a bit of both. I mean, I started preparing for post working life about 15 years before I finished, and I involved myself in the sort of charitable sector, helping charities, sometimes covertly, because I was sometimes helping charities whose mission was in contradiction to some of the clients I was serving. So I've always been passionate about promoting environmental causes from way back when I was a student. And so I've, historically I've helped organizations like Friends of the Earth and Woodland Trust on sort of private projects and helping them think through things. And I knew that, when it came time to sort of hang up the pen, so to speak, that I would, I'm not somebody who's going to retire to the golf course. But I also initiated, if you like, sort of professional collaborations that were outside the practice of law, but to do with the legal profession. So I was one of the founding directors of something which is now called the Legal Sustainability Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
I was involved in the early days of something called the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance. And, I took on some speaking engagements where I got to sort of offer opinions on professional ethics and things like that. So in a sense, all of that has continued, or evolving, but continued, even though the actual sort of working for a salary has stopped. So I did those things in parallel, but obviously since freeing myself from the shackles of a professional practice, lots of other things have presented themselves, and I'm learning 2.5 years in that actually you don't actually have to say yes to everything, and it's easy to feel that if you're not really busy doing everything, that nobody loves you, and So, I've made some wrong calls and involved myself in wrong things. And it's like, that first week at university when you surround yourself desperately with friends, and then you spend the rest of the term trying to shake some of them off.
Very good. Very good. Well, look, you've brilliantly introduced yourself. I mean, for anyone that wants to go and check out Jeff's whole history, we're obviously going to be linking to his LinkedIn profile, and you can go and check things out from there. But Jeff, I want to ask you one. You've mentioned ethics actually a number of times in that introduction, and I'm always really interested to hear about kind of those formative experiences of of our guests that have helped sort of shape their view of ethics, and have perhaps then gone on to influence ethics at work and in their professional life. Can you take us back and recall just an experience from the earlier part of your life that kind of did that for you?
Because I was sort of interested in sustainability, and the legal profession, just like any other profession, fundamentally it's a business with lots of people doing work which has a carbon footprint. And back in the early days of climate consciousness, if you like, the thing we used to focus on was our own carbon footprint. And, people would say, well, you need to create software programs so that computers turn themselves off, or encourage people to turn lights off. And so I was sort of involved in that. That was the Legal Sustainability Alliance's sort of original remit, was to try to come to terms with that. But actually, as I become better informed in this area, I realized that actually we were completely focusing on the wrong thing, because, of course, the biggest part of the carbon footprint of a business, as everyone now knows, and the terminology is completely familiar now, is the Scope 3 impact. So what it is that your product does. And in professional terms, the product is advice. And so, I sort of had this sort of, moment of realization that all of this effort about getting people to turn the lights off or ride a bike to work was great and necessary, but completely insufficient. And that actually the real issue for professions, as indeed any service business, is, what are your products going into? What are they facilitating? And so, the idea emerged of, in the sort of advisory services businesses, of advised emissions. So what is it that your advice is facilitating? And at the same time, people were learning that their reputation and their impact and the way in which people perceive those as businesses can be embellished or improved if they appear to be sensitive to and conscious of their climate impacts. But actually, in the early days, people were simply focusing on, riding to work and that sort of Scope 1, Scope 2 type thing, as we would now call it. And so, for me, that was the realization that we were not entirely neutral. That as a service provider, we couldn't just say, well, it's not us doing that, it's our client doing that. One of the great sort of, foundational premises of the legal industry, for very, very good reasons, is that you're not associated with your clients. And that's to allow people to be properly represented. And most acutely, that's in the area of criminal law. Somebody who has been accused of a crime must have, however serious and awful that crime is, must be capable of being represented without the lawyer being tainted, if you like, by that representation. And that principle it runs right across the legal profession. But I started to challenge that thinking in my own mind, that actually could we, or could the legal profession say, we care about the climate, when actually an awful lot of the money that the business is making is being made from clients whose activities are actually harming the climate.
And was this around? You mentioned earlier about how in your career there was this sort of realization. I think you even referred to it as sort of covert support for institutions and initiatives that perhaps fell sort of slightly outside of the scope and the remit of the work that you're doing with clients. Was this sort of aligned with that realization that you've just described?
And I think it took me probably longer than it should have done to sort of pull these threads together. And, at the very outset, when I thought about becoming a lawyer, to the extent that I was capable of articulating complex thoughts at all at that age, I used to think that justice or the legal system was an instrument for achieving fairness of outcomes as between different interested parties, and therefore it was a public good, and then actually it was therefore a noble cause to be engaged in, if you like, the administration of justice and helping resolve competing interests in that way. And I think that was historically the case. But I think like all industries and professions that focus ever more on efficiency and cost reduction and productivity and those sort of things, the sort of industrialization of an activity, the legal profession lost sight of that and ended up becoming a facilitator of objectives, completely blind to what those objectives were. So it was a slow dawning realization. And of course, I got there at an age where it's perfectly possible for people to say, well, it's all very well for somebody of your age to have that sort of view, but I need to make a living. And I was sort of the second half of my career, and perhaps I had the luxury of thinking more critically about what it was that the profession was doing. But it seemed to me that I've never sort of advocated that the profession shouldn't help these businesses, but I have made the case that professions shouldn't help these businesses doing things which are, let's face it, damaging to the environment, and at the same time say that they are not damaging the environment, because that's the bit that feels to me a little bit too cute, really. So I wasn't really arguing for a change, but I was arguing for greater transparency and honesty, which comes back to some of your other activities around greenwashing, and greenwashing is an overused term, I think. But you should do what you say you do, and you shouldn't say things and then do the opposite. So I think that was this sort of awakening for me, and a realization that perhaps the legal profession had become too much of a business and not enough of a sort of a publicly focused profession that kept in mind the public interest.
Hear, Jeff. You're going to get your first hear of the show. I could not concur and agree with you to any greater extent. Like, how are things in the profession? Do you think where things are improving in the sense of? Well,
I think there was a period where, for all sorts of reasons across the spectrum of sustainability issues, the E, the S, and the G, professional service firms, just like every other business, impacted with a number of sort of wake-up calls, whether that was Black Lives Matter or Me Too or gender inclusivity, etc. All of those things, and in American terminology, the DEI programs, and so there was a big push towards sort of better performance in those areas. My sense is that just like every other business at the moment, perhaps the pursuit of those objectives has been slightly downgraded in priority. And if you look at some of the American firms have faced an extremely hostile political environment in the US, you can see that some firms who were big champions of that range of issues have utterly capitulated at the first sound of alarm. And look, I'm not saying that it would have been an easy decision to remain principled, but some firms have remained principled, and others less so. So, I think there's a little bit of a retreat, but I think, in a sense, the spotlight remains on professional service firms just like anyone else, and I think the sort of the free pass, if you like, that service firms perhaps once thought they had, aren't quite there anymore. So even if there's a little bit of a sort of a modulation or an ebbing and flowing of progress on these things, employees and clients' expectations of what professional firms will do, are a little bit more demanding than I think they once were.
Fascinating. Yes, the cat is out of the bag in that sense. But Jeff, let's move forward. I know we're going to switch focus slightly from what we've just been discussing, which is super interesting, onto this week's article. Would you mind just providing our listeners and viewers with a little bit of a summary?
So the article, as you mentioned at the top of this, was understanding the environmental attitude behavior gap, the moderating role of dispositional mindfulness, and it's by four Italian academics, all of whom are based somewhere in Rome, I think. And interestingly, one of them is also part of a school of Buddhist studies in India. So although this isn't really about meditative mindfulness, and I had to look at what dispositional mindfulness is. And I think in easy terms, it's sort of innate mindfulness, so that your natural state. It's addressing the question of, what are the factors that feed into this gap between positive environmental intentions and positive environmental behaviors, and one can easily answer or list some items that are going to get in the way between I really won't ever fly again, and oh goodness gracious me, I need to go and get on a flight because somebody's getting married that I need to attend to. There are all sorts of personal conveniences, or what they describe here as hedonistic and egotistical reasons to interrupt the flow between intention and behavior. So, it's actually quite a difficult article in a sense. I don't know whether it's categorized as neuroscience or behavioral psychology or what. But quite a lot of the article is explaining the statistical analysis that went into reading the conclusions. But they come up with, if you like, the conclusion that those people who are better at self-regulation, so making decisions that perhaps involve some inconvenience or resistance of temptation, and executive function. So executive function is another term I had to sort of check out, but executive function is the mental faculties that allow you to focus on delivering an objective. So they conclude that there is a correlation between this sort of innate mindfulness or self-awareness, ability to observe in a neutral, non-judgmental way, with sort of pro-environmental behavior. So putting that another way, people who are more thoughtful behave better towards the environment. And that, if you simplify it in that sense, it feels reasonably intuitive. And if I was being dismissive of the academic oeuvre, I would say, really, do we need 12 pages to reach them? But I think the point is that it's a small building block that leads you to thinking perhaps differently about what interventions there are. What is it that you need to do to get people to behave in a different way? One of their conclusions, again, which I felt was, something. Is it self-evident? Anyway, it's something I've observed, that simply giving people more information isn't good enough, and So, they draw that conclusion that for policymakers, information isn't the answer. They conclude that maybe there is a role for working on people's mindfulness. Now, that's where I think, one could be a little bit more cynical and say, we really think that it's feasible to engage people in practicing mindfulness to improve their mindfulness capabilities. Again, I think that's probably not what.
Jeff, sorry to interrupt you there, but so from your perspective, that's a folly. That the idea that we could in some way implement, public policy or campaigns of some description in order to encourage people to be more mindful in making decisions. In your mind, that's not achievable.
Well, good challenge. I don't know is the answer, but if I was sort of writing the headlines for a skeptical media covering this article, you could say, Italian academics recommend meditation as the answer to environmental problems, and I think you can. It's trite, but I mean that's if you take it that way, that literally, I think you end up with that sort of silly answer. But I think it's an interesting contribution to the discussion about how do you nudge behaviour. And actually, the UK was the first government to set up what was colloquially called as a nudge unit, a behavioural insight team. Actually, I mean, this article sort of led me off to sort of look a little bit about that. And I found this very interesting article by somebody at the LSE, which said the really important thing, because there's lots of these behavioural insight teams now all over the world. The really important thing is that they're part of government, they're owned by government. Well, of course, our government has just sold off our behavioural insight team, so they're obviously not that interested. But if you look through, for example, in 2022, 2023, the Climate Change Committee put out a report about how do you change behaviour. And so what are we talking about changing behaviour in climate terms? That's things like flying less, having a less meat and dairy, smaller meat and dairy component to diet, moving from fossil fuel driven vehicles to electric vehicles, those sorts of behaviour changes. And these are necessary. So all the experts and the science shows that we need to make these shifts. But how do you get people to do them? And so what this is saying is it's just not enough to say it's better to eat less meat than to eat more meat. That you actually need to do something else to condition people to be aware of the consequences, perhaps to be observant of some of the benefits or the disbenefits. And so that's a useful point to make. But I think it's and this article was written, I think, in 2023 as well. Those reports from the Climate Change Committee, and there was also a report from the House of Lords on the same subject. And they all did just focus on information, that there needed to be information campaigns to educate or inform the public in order to make choices. And of course, our politics of whatever persuasion you like to look at them, they're all very reticent to tell people what to do. And so, information, if you like, is the least bad version of teaching behaviour, because you're not saying you can't fly twice a year. And, there are various ideas out there about sort of frequent flyer type levies. Because, when you look at things like this, you find that actually, in the same way that wealth is unequally distributed, so are flights. And it's actually, there's a strata of society which is responsible for a large part of the aviation-based emissions in any society. So how do you change all of that? And the answer is it's not information. You've got to either, in my view, regulate, or you've got to inform people in a much more complex and nuanced way and incentivize them to change that behavior. That's not what this article about, but that's where it took me to.
And Jeff, and that was brilliantly summarized. And I was going to say, for our listeners and viewers that want to check out the article, which Jeff is correct, is it's heavy lifting. But Jeff, when you described there the regulatory point, I want to leave because I feel like that's a bigger conversation, a separate one. But in terms of the more complex, the more nuanced way of incentivizing behavior change. What examples, if any, have you seen of that being done particularly well? And what lessons can be drawn from those examples to perhaps the UK government?
Well, I can't think of any that have been done particularly well. I mean, if you look at the, yeah, I mean, if you look at the things that are going on in the UK, there's obviously an accelerating shift towards electric vehicles. There is an accelerating shift away from gas boilers, and those are operating through a little bit of a sort of a jigsaw puzzle with many missing pieces of incentives through things like the boiler upgrade scheme. Or latterly, very recently, we've had the introduction of incentives for buying electric vehicles subject to certain price limits and things like that. And there's obviously these mandates in the future about which really operate at the manufacturer level to get them to invest in the sorts of models that you will be able to sell post 2030 and post 2035. But if you look at those. They've been led primarily despite the fact that it's far more expensive for people to do it. So, the people who've been the early adopters of those sorts of technologies have been people who've been able to afford, if you like, let's call it the sort of the ethical choice or the pro-environmental choice, notwithstanding the absence of the obvious and strong economic case for doing it. So I think we're and in other areas like flying, there's air passenger tax, which has made no difference whatsoever. There's nothing really out there on in terms of public information about diet. I suppose there are a few things around sugar and things like that, but I think we're nowhere, and I think it's politically toxic for. You can just imagine. Well, you can't imagine a right-wing flavoured government in this country being in the least bit bothered about any of this stuff because of the sort of principles of personal choice and non-intervention. You sort of can't imagine a left-wing flavoured government in this country doing it for fear of being, 2025's version of Maggie Thatcher Milk Snatcher. It's a sort of, so it's for either side of the spectrum. This is an absolute horror show to get into this, even though, rationally one can see that it's absolutely necessary.
So, and Jeff, taking that as the sort of the baseline view of the circumstance that we find ourselves in, how hopeful are you of change of the kind of innovation and development, not just in terms of regulation, but in terms of the way that people are behaving and engaging with some of the industries that you've described? Like, do you have hope? And if you do have hope, what are the things that give you hope?
So I do, and I tell myself regularly that I must be more optimistic, and of course then I am. But actually, if you look at that,
you're a very mindful and thoughtful chap.
Exactly right. Exactly.
Indeed.
So these things are happening almost regardless, and perhaps this is why it's justified for governments not to do anything, because ultimately they do happen, and we see every month better EV sales certainly in younger age groups. People are eating less meat. There are people who are more thoughtful about their air travel. I mean, I sort of hang out or occasionally get together with people in my area here down in Sussex who are sustainability professionals, and I'm absolutely in awe of the discipline they bring to the way they run their lives. And to give you an example, there's been a drought in the southeast of England amongst other places, and it's very, very clear that everyone takes that extremely seriously, and they're tipping their washing up bowl into the garden and things like that, rather than, as one might expect, ignoring it and just turning the hose on in their garden or whatever. And I sort of see that sort of discipline all around me, in my bubble, perhaps.
Mm.
And I think that people do get it, and I actually think the public attitudes to these things are ahead of government, and that's true just in the general population. And that there are surveys out there which show that actually pro climate initiatives are much more popular than you would think, listening to the media talking about the political class. But also at the business level, most businesses, and I say this because there was a survey recently by the Climate Majority Project which showed this, that most businesses think that there needs to be greater regulatory intervention, but the politicians sort of say they're not hearing this from the businesses that they're interacting with. But I am positive that we'll get there. I'm not positive that we'll get there in the time frame that we should get there, because there are so many obstacles to this, and even putting aside what's going on in the States, every government has got the excuse of, I'm dealing with geopolitical and economic issues, and therefore I really can't be bothered to deal with this thing you're talking to me about.
So, in light of that, let's move on now. And I know you have preempted this, Jeff, by asking whether or not you can get multiple usage out of this magic wand, which I've given you. It's a first on the responsible edge, but I very much am happy for you to do so. But in light of your point there about your concern that we're not going to get to where we need to get to as quickly as we need to get to because of the obstacles at play, go wild with your magic wand. Like, what would you change overnight that would allow us to get there in the timescales that we need to?
Well, I'm gonna play my sort of old lawyer trick of actually saying that even though I've got lots of things to say, it's all going to come down to one wave of the magic wand.
Okay, very good.
I would sort of. It's a really fascinating question, and because as practical people, we tend not to engage with the fantastical or the hypothetical situation where and we always sabotage our own ideas by saying, of course that will never happen. So what's the point of even thinking about it? But so this is quite an indulgence in a sense. But what came to my mind in trying to answer this question was something that I heard Naomi Klein say a few years ago when I heard her speak, and she used the phrase that it must be true that every human life is of equal value, and that's for me it's a really, really resonant phrase, that because when you just take it at its face value, you say, of course that must be right, that there's nobody whose life is in value terms lower than mine. But when you actually think about, is that something that we can actually observe? The answer is absolutely, we cannot observe that. And then, therefore, if you use that sort of phrase as a guide in making decisions or assessing what's going on, I think it's quite a useful way of looking at it, because if that's not something that is a likely outcome from what you're doing, I think it should make you pause and think, well, is that really the right thing to do in that case? So it's a really powerful, challenging implication, it seems to me, to think along those lines. And therefore that sort of takes me then to, what would be the circumstances if that really was something that we were seeking to achieve? And it takes you into the wealth distribution. And actually, I could wave my magic wand and change the distribution of wealth, not just in this country, but worldwide, where, we've seen escalating inequality in both wealth and income in many of the sort of big, powerful Western economies. And what does that give rise to? It gives rise to insecurity. It gives rise to isolation and poverty, etc. All sorts of things flow from that. And the UK, of course, is one of the most unequal countries. The UK and the US are really up in the top of the leagues there. And so, could you, like Rutger Bregman has suggested, is there some multiplier so that nobody should have more than 20 times the lowest amount of wealth? You'd still be extremely wealthy. You'd still have the incentive to accumulate and innovate, whatever that figure is, whether it's 20 or 200 or whatever. But at the moment, that multiplier is in the billions. Is there something you can do to address equality such that you take away some of the competitive, security-driven or insecurity-driven behaviors in the world, and actually try to encourage greater, collaboration and cooperation at the expense of acute competition? I mean, we need some competition, but do we need competition such that lots of people have the boot on the back of their neck? And I think it also gives rise to the possibility of breaking down the sort of fortress mentality. And you see that, a lot of the underpinnings of the, if you like, the sort of right wing, political thinking at the moment is the sort of apocalyptic. I'm going to be one of the last to survive when everything goes wrong, and I'll do that by having a luxury bunker in New Zealand. And having unfathomable wealth, and I will be immune from the climate apocalypse, or whatever. Now, that's not necessarily what they're all saying, but there is that sort of undertone of the end of times, and that an alternative would be that actually we all try to make the best of what we've got. There's no shortage of wealth and value on this planet. It's just the way it's distributed. We can feed ourselves, we can equip ourselves, but the distribution is problematic.
In that scenario where we set a limit on X times the amount of income from the lowest to the highest, or wealth from the lowest to highest, what happens at the point at which those that are innovative, that are creative, that do wealth generate, essentially reach their maximum? What happens at that point to them, to their businesses, etc.?
Well, you're doing that thing that I always refuse to do in my own family life, which is to engage reality in a hypothetical situation. And there would need to be some mechanism to take it away. But I mean, I think where I'm sort of heading for is, with my one real wave of the magic wand, is a world where excessive accumulation is seen as, gives rise to pariah status. There's no need for it, and then it's socially unacceptable to and actually people make this case now that there is no reason why anyone should be a billionaire in this world, and yet there are. I mean, I'm not making that point, but
really?
Excessive accumulation should be seen as give rise to forced redistribution. Because it's a zero-sum game in a sense. That accumulation of wealth in the hands of one tier of society comes at the expense, unfortunately, of others in society. So maybe we have to give that Marx guy another crack at it. Maybe he was onto something that actually, a more sort of communitarian approach to things would be good. So coming to my point. And trying to sort of temper the outer reaches of my suggestions, that we should be open-minded and open to discuss constructively alternatives. And it brings to mind that phrase that I've never actually tracked down whoever said it, but that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And I mean, unfortunately, the end of the world is available on shelves near you. I mean, but just this idea that actually we can think differently rather than being constrained by orthodoxy. That's resistance to even engage in discussion about alternative ways of doing things. Because it's just so easy for people to say, well, that's not going to work. And I suppose what I wish for is a more open discussion about alternatives to a system that we're currently in, which is not serving the bulk of people very well.
Well, you're going to get your follow-up here of the show. I mean, on that need for, Yes, optimistic. Yes, perhaps hypothetical evaluations and thoughts about what the future could hold, possibly could hold, I think is absolutely essential. That's how we breed the collective mindset and the innovations required in order to get to where we need to get to. So
just coming back to the point about the sort of implicit subconscious apocalyptic thinking of the sort of tech bro community, having that doesn't have to be that way. Can't we find a better way? There's very little space for that discussion in public discourse because it's all sort of a Punch and Judy show, and I think it would be engaging and healthy to whether this is through citizens forums or a different approach to politics, a less fearful approach to politics and a less power-centric approach, to actually encourage the citizens of a country to have that sort of discussion amongst themselves.
Anyway. And what I love, Jeff, because it's a brilliant suggestion, is how actually we can then pull this back and tie it to, I know, very sort of broad stroke sort of way, but the whole impression of the article around facilitating that more mindful way of approaching decision making. Well, what you're describing here is perhaps a more mindful way of thinking about, our collective perspectives on things, our way that our governments run, our politics runs, etc.
Yeah.
Jeff, it's been a whistle-stop tour, but absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on the show this morning and sharing some of your thoughts with us.
My great pleasure, and thank you for indulging me.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big, big thank you to my guest, Jeff Twentyman, for joining me on today's show. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the independent mark of integrity for sustainability reporting. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.